Hello students, today we're going to look at Chapter 17, the urinary system, and welcome to your online survey of human anatomy and physiology. Now, when I was a young person, we called this the excretory system, but as you will recall, when we looked at skin, a little bit of waste product was excreted through the skin with sweat. We looked at the digestive system and we found that we eliminated waste or excreted waste products left over from what we didn't use from the food that we ate. Also in the respiratory system, we had to get rid of that carbon dioxide, so we in a sense excreted that carbon dioxide. And then with this system, we're going to get rid of waste products. So there are actually a lot of ways that we excrete unwanted substances. So it was sort of a misnomer, so it's now called the urinary system. The parts of the urinary system consist of the kidneys, two ureters leading down to the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Now be careful not to mix up the words ureter and urethra. There are two ureters that lead to the urinary bladder and one urethra. From the kidneys, the ureter will take the urine to the urinary bladder, and then from the urinary bladder to outside of the body, it will travel through the tube known as the urethra. The function of the kidney is to eliminate organic wastes. Also plays a role in regulation of the concentration of important ions, your sodiums, potassiums, calciums, and other various ions. Acid-base balance, or pH. It is very important to maintain proper pH throughout our systems. The regulation of erythrocyte production. Now, what's an erythrocyte? That is correct. It is a red blood cell. And you've already learned that red blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. So what happens is the kidneys will secrete a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin signals the red bone marrow to produce red blood cells. It plays a role in regulation of blood pressure by regulating the blood volume. Okay, the more fluid you put back into the blood, you're going to increase the volume, which helps to regulate blood pressure. Has a limited control of blood glucose and amino acid concentration. It plays a role in activation of vitamin D, and vitamin D is important to be able to utilize the calcium that you take in. And it plays a role in elimination of toxic wastes. The external structure of the kidneys, they're sort of bean-shaped. They are 12 centimeters long. 12 centimeters would be less than, to be around 5 inches in long, and then about 6 centimeters wide would be less than 3 inches wide, and 3 centimeters thick is just slightly over 1 inch thick. They are positioned retroperitoneally. Now, what does that mean? Retro is behind the peritoneal area, and if you will recall, the organs in the peritoneal area are called the serous membrane on the organs was called the visceral peritoneal or peritoneum. Okay, the cavity that has those organs in it was called the peritoneal cavity. It is part of the abdominal cavity, abdominopelvic cavity, and the membrane lining that cavity was called the parietal peritoneum. Now, retroperitoneally means that it is behind that parietal peritoneal membrane. Okay, so the kidneys are actually not in that peritoneal region, it is behind it. It is still in the abdominopelvic cavity, but there is a membrane that's almost like, it's thin, it's almost like saran wrap that separates the kidneys from those other organs. So it's retroperitoneum. They're found in the small of your back. The left kidney is slightly higher than the right. And why would the left kidney be slightly higher than the right? If you said that the liver is on the right side, then you would be correct. The liver displaces that kidney, makes it a little bit lower. It will be a little lower than the left kidney. It is a bean-shaped organ, and in this area here of this bean-shaped organ that curves inward, that's called the hilum. The hilum is where you have blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, and the ureter will enter the kidney in the area of the hilum. This curve right here of that. That's why they call those beans kidney beans. The shape of the kidney and that bean are pretty much the same. The internal structure, in from the hilum, let's look, we have blood vessels entering, but you have the ureter, and the ureter gives rise to the renal pelvis. Okay, right here in the hilum, you have the renal pelvis, this large area here. And as you go inward, the pelvis gives rise to the major calyx. Plural would be calyxes. One would be a calyx. Okay, so major calyx from the pelvis to this larger area beyond, or a little bit smaller than the pelvis, but larger would be the major calyx, and then as you move this direction, you come into the area of the minor calyx. This is a minor calyx, this is a minor calyx, major calyxes, and then the renal pelvis is this area. Okay, the kidney, just like, remember when we looked at the adrenal gland, we said that there was a medulla and a cortex. The medulla was deeper and the cortex was that outer layer. The kidney is divided in the same way. So the renal, we started in from the hilum, we looked at the renal pelvis, gave rise to the major calyx, and the major calyx gave rise to the minor calyx. And then this area in this renal medulla, you have the renal pyramid. So this area here is called a renal pyramid. So this whole area, a renal pyramid, here's another one, here's another renal pyramid, and here's another renal pyramid. Now, you know what a pyramid looks like. This area of the apex of that pyramid, where you have the minor calyx and then the pyramid, as those two meet, that's called the papilla, or papilla. Okay, so you would have, let's back up and go through it again. You had the ureter, gives rise to the renal pelvis, gives rise to the major calyx, the minor calyx, then the papilla to the renal pyramids. Okay, those renal pyramids are in the area, what area? The medulla. Okay, then out in this area, the outer layer is called the cortex. Now the cortex, the renal cortex, will dip in between the pyramids here, and this area in between the pyramids is known as a renal column. Okay, so the cortex and then the renal column. Now if you take a little area of this pyramid, the renal pyramid, you can see here is the cortex, here is the area of the medulla, here's the papilla, and the minor calyx. Now if you zoom in on this even further, where you have, it looks like little beads on a string, these are nephrons, and we're going to go into more details on nephrons next. Okay, but this is a renal corpuscle, and a tubular system is a nephron. You will have millions of nephrons in this kidney. You have many thousands, hundreds of thousands in each of these pyramids. There's over millions in this kidney of these nephrons. Now before we talk in more detail about the nephron, let's talk about how the kidney gets its blood supply. Now the blood comes from the, when you were studying blood vessels, you know that the blood is supplied by the renal artery. The renal artery comes off of the abdominal aorta, so it would be the abdominal aorta gives rise to the renal artery. It supplies the kidneys with an extremely large amount of blood. It, at any one time while you're resting, will have 10 to 30% of the total cardiac output will be sent to the kidney. So it has a very major blood supply. So the renal artery, here, let me go back. The renal artery will branch off into, the renal artery branches off into the interlobar arteries. So you can see they'll branch and branch into the interlobar arteries. And those interlobar arteries will branch even more to, there's still a fairly large vessel. It's passing in between these pyramids. Passing in between the pyramids would be the interlobar artery, and then it branches into the arcuate arteries, and it branches even more into the cortical radiate arteries in the cortex, cortical radiate arteries. And then the cortical radiate arteries will branch into what are called afferent arterioles. So now that these vessels are getting a little smaller, so afferent or afferent arterioles is after from a cortical radiant artery to the afferent arteriole. There's the cortical, here's the blow up. This whole structure is a nephron, and from the cortical radiate artery it will branch more and give rise to the afferent or afferent arteriole. Then that would enter the corpuscle here, the renal corpuscle, and as it comes out it is called the efferent arteriole or efferent arteriole. It'll branch off and go into two different directions. It will continue on so that you have a blood supply and passing of materials between the bloodstream and the tubules through these afferent arterioles that go in through all these tubules. But then this branch will branch even more so you have peritubular capillaries. These peritubulars are around the tubules is what that word means, peritubule capillaries. Okay, we know that you have arterioles to capillaries to vanules. So these peritubule capillaries will come back together. You had divergent, here convergence. They come together to form larger vessels, and then these larger vessels will come together to form the cortical radiant vein. And then the cortical radiant vein will converge to form a larger arcuate vein, and then the interlobar comes down between these pyramids, interlobar vein, and it'll converge into the renal vein. The renal vein will dump the blood into the inferior vena cava. Okay, and take them back to the heart, and for the circulation to begin all over again. Now, blood supplies to the nephron. You have the glomerular capillary receives blood from the afferent arterioles. So you have these capillaries here. Glomerular capillary receives blood from the afferent arteriole and passes it to the efferent or efferent arteriole. So this is a network of arterioles here, okay, within this capsule, the glomerular capsule. Renal, also known as a renal capsule. Okay, the renal capsule is the whole structure. The glomerulus is this, and then you have the structure, glomerulus. Okay, the efferent arteriole gives rise to the peritubular system, which surrounds the tubules, and then the capillaries are called the vesa recta, dips down into the medulla. Okay, so this is this area where you have the peritubular capillaries is called the vesa recta. Vesa recta. Okay, so the peritubular capillaries, vesa recta, it's all these capillaries that surround this nephron loop here, the nephron loop. And you know that the purpose of those capillaries is for exchange of materials between that nephron loop and the bloodstream. Okay, let's go over this one more time again. You have the glomerular capillary receives blood from the afferent arteriole. It comes in from that interlobar artery to the cortico-radiant artery to the afferent or afferent arteriole. It passes through the glomerulus, and as it comes out, it gives rise to the efferent arteriole, and that branches off, and it continues around these convoluted tubules, and one branch extends down around the nephron loop and forms the peritubular capillaries. The peritubular system surrounds the tubules, and then those capillary loops are called the vasa recta. Vasa means vessels, basically. Recta dip down into the medulla. This area would be the cortex, and this dips down into the medulla. Okay, let's just review the path of the blood from the abdominal aorta and back to the inferior vena cava. The abdominal aorta gives rise to the renal artery that comes in through the hilum of the kidney, through the renal pelvis, branches off into the interlobar arteries, and the interlobar arteries runs between those renal pyramids. Between the renal pyramids, branches off, and it goes from the area of the medulla to the cortex and branches off to the arcuate arteries, and then those branch off into the cortical radiate arteries, which branch even further and form the afferent arterioles. From arteries to arterioles, the afferent arteriole around the glomerulus and into the glomerulus, and that gives rise to the efferent arteriole, and the efferent arteriole emerges from the glomerulus and branches off into peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta, and those peritubular capillaries will converge again and come together and form the cortico-radiate vein, and then those come together to form the arcuate vein, and then the interlobar in between those pyramids again, moving toward the pelvis to the renal vein, and the renal vein taking that blood after all that processing to the inferior vena cava. Now the nephron is the functional unit of the kidneys. Again, there are millions of them. This is very simplified, but you have a renal capsule or corpuscle, and then a renal tubule. The tubule is very long. If we could stretch it out, it'd be extremely long. It's a very convoluted tubule. So the nephron is made up of a renal capsule or corpuscle, and the renal tubule. Now let's look at the renal corpuscle. It is a filtering unit. The blood is brought in via the afferent arteriole in this direction. It goes through the glomerular capsule into the glomerulus, and the glomerulus plays a role in exchanging substances, and things are passed from the bloodstream to the interstitial fluid in the glomerular capsule. There is an exchange there, okay? So this glomerulus has these tiny cells called podocytes found in the glomerulus, and then the afferent arteriole will give rise to the efferent arteriole or efferent, and that takes the blood away from the renal corpuscle and where it is processed even more. And from the renal corpuscle, the efferent artery will branch again and again, and the upper branch in the renal cortex will vascularize the proximal convoluted tubule, and then there will be branches that branch off from the efferent arteriole to the paratubular capillaries. Okay, paratubular meaning around the tubes. These capillaries will be around the tubes, the paratubular capillaries. Okay, so this is the proximal convoluted tubule, and then these capillaries are around the nephron loop here. From this proximal tubule, you have the descending limb of the nephron loop, and when it begins to rise, that is the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and that gives rise to the distal convoluted tubule. So you need to recall your directional terms. Closest to the body was proximal, and away from the body was the distal, in this case distal tubule. Okay. The glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, gives rise to the nephron loop, the descending limb of the nephron loop, the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule will join up with the collecting duct. So all along the way we have urine formation here, and the descending limb, ascending limb of the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule dumps into the collecting duct, and all those collecting ducts dump into, will go through the and that collecting duct will dump into through the papilla to the minor calyx, to the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, to the ureter, to the urinary bladder, to the urethra, and outside the body. And that is the end of part 1. We'll talk about urine formation next in part 2.